If the debacle in Afghanistan reminded you of something from history class, you're not alone. An overconfident invasion, a nearly impossible mission due to treacherous terrain, the underestimation of a determined enemy, thousands of innocent lives lost. Finally, a retreat, followed by a swift reversal of pretty much everything. Yes, this has happened before. Toward the end of the Vietnam War, as in Afghanistan, American politicians signaled that they had reached the limit of their engagement. For Vietnam, President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger pressed for a peace treaty that gave the U.S. a way out. For Afghanistan, Donald Trump's withdrawal agreement last February and Joe Biden's campaign statements promised America's military presence in Afghanistan was winding down. From both Saigon and Kabul, clear and shocking images flooded our media of desperate Americans and thousands of locals fleeing imprisonment, torture, and death. And in both cases, American-trained and equipped militaries lost the will to fight when U.S. forces departed, and U.S.-funded equipment fell into enemy hands. But as George Mason professor of law Ilya Somin said,
I think historians and other scholars will be working for a long time on the question of how similar this is or different from the Vietnam War. In one sense, it seems to me that this actually is a more egregious error than what happened back then.
Because at least you could say this much about Vietnam. The American pullout was more organized than what we saw in Afghanistan. The week before Saigon fell, 15,000 people left on scheduled flights. They were soon followed by an additional 80,000 evacuees by plane. In 1975 alone, 125,000 people left South Vietnam, followed by more than 5,000 in 1976 and 77. The pullout from Afghanistan, on the other hand, was an unmitigated disaster in multiple ways. To understand how, and so that we can learn from our mistakes, let's start with a brief history of invasions of Afghanistan. Because the truth is, America's invasion was only the latest failure of a foreign army to conquer the graveyard of empires. Afghanistan's combination of desert and mountain climate presented trouble for Alexander the Great, the Mongols, and the British, even at the height of their powers. It was, in a word, hubris that proved their downfall, a belief in their infallibility, and the inferiority of local intelligence, technology, and will. More recently, though, in 1979, it was the Soviet Union that invaded Afghanistan in an attempt to protect a communist government that was, not surprisingly, deeply unpopular. What many people don't realize, however, is that the United States was involved then, too. Its behind-the-scenes intervention came back to bite the U.S. in a tragic way. The CIA's Operation Cyclone, which began in 1979, armed and financed the Afghan Mujahideen, a group of Islamic rebels that fought against the Soviet Union and the communist regime. And guess who also financed and joined the Mujahideen in 1979 and became one of its most popular leaders? While it's not directly true that the CIA funded al-Qaeda, it does lend credence to Rand Paul's words.
But this has been our problem with our foreign policy for decades, Republican and Democrat. We funded bin Laden. We funded the Mujahideen. We were in favor of radical jihad because they were the enemy of our enemy.
It also speaks to a deeper truth about war. Real-life war is not some chess game or risk board. It is too complicated, too difficult to predict, and too long-term for any 4 or 8-year politician to mastermind. Consider that there was only one dissenting vote in the entire U.S. Congress against a war in Afghanistan. Consider that NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and only time after the 9/11 attacks, making an attack on one member an attack on all. Consider, too, the UN resolution in the wake of 9/11 that the U.S. could respond by any means necessary. In short, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan had closer to unanimous political support than any war ever fought. And it still ended in disaster. It's not hard to understand why. War inherently means destruction of capital, not to mention innocent lives. The very nature of war guarantees misery for all involved, especially for civilians and troops on the ground in invaded countries. Those civilians and troops in Afghanistan who supported American efforts represent a rare instance in which we should strive to imitate Vietnam. In the years after the Vietnam War ended, the only morally justifiable thing to do was to open America's doors to the Vietnamese, whose worlds the Americans had turned upside down and whose lives were in danger, as the Viet Cong sought to arrest and kill anyone who would help the U.S. military. President Gerald Ford and Congress agreed to pass the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act in 1976, which allowed Vietnamese refugees to enter the United States and allocated $405 million in resettlement aid, despite an initial resentment toward those refugees from the American public. According to a 1975 poll, only 36% of Americans favored Vietnamese immigration. Fortunately, though, in the 4 years after the war in Vietnam ended, approximately 300,000 refugees entered from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and between 1981 and 2000, the U.S. accepted more than 530,000 Vietnamese political refugees and asylum seekers. But even setting the moral question, it's also worth noting that this policy of open borders toward refugees from Southeast Asia resulted in more wealth and opportunity, not just for the refugees, but for everyone.
If you look at aggregate data on Vietnamese immigrants, they've actually done very well. They have incomes and education levels on average higher than the average for the United States. They've made all sorts of contributions to American society in a variety of industries and businesses. And overall, the migration has been an enormous boon for that million people and their children who were saved from tyranny and oppression. But it was also a great boon for American society more generally, which benefited from their contributions.
Unfortunately, however, a troubling current of anti-immigration, in part due to Islamophobia, has resulted in little political will to accept Afghan refugees. Islamophobia, of course, was at the center of the war on terror from the beginning. Look no further than the story of Mohammed Salman Hamdani, a Pakistani-American EMT and New York police cadet who died trying to save lives on 9/11, but who was initially considered a suspect in the attacks. Still, the facts are plain. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan, did 2 decades worth of damage, and endangered the lives of anyone who tried to help the American cause by allowing the Taliban back into power.
It's wrong and unjust to condemn people to lives of poverty and oppression simply because they happen to be born in the wrong place or to the wrong parents. The fact that somebody was born in Afghanistan or that their parents were Afghans has no moral relevance to how much freedom they deserve.
And when you think about the contributions Vietnamese refugees have made to the American social landscape and economy, the right decision becomes even clearer. Afghan journalist and PhD student Parwiz Mosamim knows firsthand the human toll of war.
I'm just worried about my sisters the most because my biggest sister she's about to graduate from school, and she always telling me that she wants to be a journalist in Afghanistan, and she wants to continue her higher education in other countries, and she has a lot of plans for herself, as well as my middle sister. She's in 7th grade, and my smallest sister, she's in the 1st grade. So my brother is very small. They are afraid, they are scared, they are somehow disappointed, especially my biggest sister. When I'm talking with her, she's worried about her future.
It's worth reiterating, a war sanctioned by almost the entire U.S. Congress, NATO, and the UN ended with 2,448 American service members killed as of April 2020, 3,846 contractors killed, 66,000 Afghan national military and police, and 47,245 Afghan civilians killed, and 44 aid workers and 72 journalists were killed. It cost trillions of dollars, too. And while President Bush tried to convince the world that the mission in Iraq had been accomplished, no one could even pretend the same about Afghanistan. The only way to salvage some kind of victory from this mess, and the right thing to do morally, is to accept Afghan refugees with open arms.